Okay, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Spring break is a week away. No, y'all don't got plans? Okay, well, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to spring break. I do want to say this before we talk about this conversation about, which will be our last one in this Jesus and series for this school year. I just want to say, man, you have a week left till spring break, and for the next week, you can do hard things. So like this next week, for some of us, it might be difficult. You might have things you have to get through, whatever your finals, midterms, whatever these are, whatever your midterms are, whatever you have to read, whatever assignments you have, you can do hard things for a few days. Yeah? No? You can do hard things just for a few days. You got this. Spring break's coming with or without you. Anyway, you got this. Jesus and anxiety. Today we have Dr. Sarah Drivdahl. She's the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Did I say that correctly? Arts and Sciences. I'm so sorry. Arts and Sciences. Some people don't know you. So would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So this is my 18th or 19th year at Northwest University. I absolutely love being at Northwest. I have a son who's a freshman here who's not in the audience this time, so I can't embarrass him. I guess I can say anything I want now. And then I have a 16-year-old son and a husband who's our architect. And I am so thankful to get to talk with you today.
Sweet. Well, thanks for being here. And let's do it. Anxiety. No, even to begin, I know people have different... this means different things to different people, and there's people are and carry this in different ways and experienced it. So some of us in this room might know anxiety from like a clinical place. Some of us maybe are in a season of it. Some of you may be more like me, where it's something you've never walked through, or maybe you've only walked through it for a short period of time. But I think most of us will, at least in our lifetime, have a friend, family member, someone we care about at the very least. So maybe this conversation isn't for your season right now, but it might be a way of helping you help someone else in the future. So with that being said, a few questions for you, Sarah. First of all, what is anxiety? How would you define it? What is it?
Great. I would say, first of all, anxiety is something I don't like. I would say that's not the definition, but it's where I start with emotionally. So what is anxiety? It's a diffuse state of emotion that's characterized by apprehension for the future. And it's diffuse, meaning that unlike fear, it's really unspecific. So if a tiger ran in the room, we would be afraid, I assume. I sure would be afraid. But then when it leaves, we'd feel a lot better. Anxiety is not like that. Anxiety is the sense that the tiger could come in the room anytime, and so it doesn't necessarily leave in the same way fear does, which makes it really difficult. So it's also characterized by some psychological symptoms. So you might notice ruminations, where you keep thinking about the same thing over and over again. You might have racing thoughts. And you might notice physical symptoms like sweating, or you're breathing really fast, things like that when you're anxious. Things that we don't really like usually, to be perfectly honest. I find that when I'm really anxious, I feel like I'm running a marathon inside, but I can't go anywhere. And part of that's because moderate to higher levels of anxiety kick off our flight or fight response. How many know what fight or flight is? Yeah, it's actually a great thing. If we didn't have fight or flight, we would not know how to deal with danger at all. We'd be a big mess as a race. So let me tell you a couple cool things about fight or flight. So first of all, one of the things it does is it increases our metabolism. We run on sugar, that's our fuel. And it takes all your stores, not all of them, you wouldn't have any left, but it takes all your sugar stores from your fat and other places and uses them to be able to move really fast. Sometimes you hear crazy stories of people in fight or flight doing amazing things like lifting cars. I don't know if those are true, but fight or flight does give you this burst of energy. It also increases cardiovascular response, so you're breathing heavy, your heart is working really well. It does cool things like you can hear better, your pupils dilate, so you can see in the dark a lot better. And my favorite thing is your blood actually shunts away from your skin into your muscles, so your muscles move better, and if you are actually cut during fight or flight, you bleed more slowly. So isn't that cool how God made us? That's also why you look pale. So if you look at anxious and fearful people, they look pale, and that's because their blood is not on the skin level anymore. Now, the thing we have to remember, though, about fight or flight, as cool as it is, all your resources are going into running and fleeing or fighting, and they're not going into thinking. So do you ever notice when you're anxious, you're not kind of with it intellectually? Maybe you noticed you sat down for a test and were so anxious you couldn't think anymore, like test anxiety. Well, anxiety, unfortunately, kicks in fight or flight, so we're not able to think quite as well. I'll give you an example of this. The other day, I had a really anxious day at work. I was going to Met Market. I was just going to get a couple things. I went to give the checker my debit card, and I couldn't remember my PIN anymore. So I know, right? I have had the same PIN for a long time. Unfortunately, I didn't write the PIN down anywhere because I was being some anxious level protective. So the woman looked at me like, is this actually your debit card? Like, who are you, weird woman? And I was like, ha ha, time to go. So you'll be glad to know that I actually remember my debit card number now, but I'm not going to share it in chapel. So that, So if you were hoping, there we go. So it kicks us into fight or flight, which is great, but it also can be, it could be not very good for the way we think sometimes as well.
And I remember in some of our conversations, we started talking about just the question, is anxiety in and of itself bad?
Yeah.
Is anxiety good, bad? How would you respond to that?
Yeah. I would actually say anxiety as the way it was made to be is actually good. And this is when you probably want to walk out of chapel because you think I'm crazy. But anxiety, like pain, is actually protective. So people who are born without pain receptors usually die really young because pain tells us when to stop. It can be out of control also, which is not good, but in its best sense, it's really helpful. And so is anxiety. So anxiety is our early warning system. It says, stay awake, pay attention, look and make sure nothing is going to hurt you. So for instance, if you are in the jungle and you think a tiger could be around, you don't want to be like sleeping. You want to be awake and alert and paying attention to threat. And that's what anxiety does. It helps us to look for threats in our environment, and it's actually healthy. So for instance, a little bit of anxiety gets you up in the morning. It gets you to the test. It helps you to study. We should all be glad we have enough social anxiety that all of us put our clothes on when we came to chapel, right? Some kinds of anxiety, like I really shouldn't say that really rude thing, is really, really helpful, actually. So it's not all bad, actually.
And with that, I know people experience anxiety to different levels, and one of the things that's maybe hard for me, even in my role, is to the word that we use.
Yeah.
Because one of my best friends growing up,
Yeah.
I was with him at 3 a.m. in the hospital when he's having a panic attack and these real things, and we had later got to work through medication and things like that. So there's that level and there's other levels of seasonal, or there's all these different things that we just even you walk around campus and it's easy for people to just go, I'm really anxious, I have anxiety, and that covers such a wide variety of different people and places. So are there different words we could use or different ways of understanding it that would be helpful?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I wish, honestly, the language did differentiate a little bit better, because we could say, I am anxious I didn't get to Menchie's before it closed, right? And that's really different than I am anxious at a clinical level. I'll say in my own life, I've struggled with anxiety on and off for most of my adult life. And it's not pleasant, to be perfectly honest, as most of you are aware in your own lives. Anxiety also has different levels. So for instance, I'd say I haven't struggled with clinical anxiety, meaning that I'm able to function usually in my normal life, but it does make it difficult. So for instance, my own anxiety, I tend to, and I think honestly, some of us get anxiety probably genetically. Some of us get anxiety from environmental. I think I personally got it both. I tend to have a highly attuned nervous system, so I'm kind of aware of too many things in life. I don't know if anybody else is like that. And I had a mom who was anxious and depressed, really at clinical levels. And so both those things in my life have combined to make really kind of a day-to-day struggle with anxiety, but that I still can live my own life. So that's kind of a moderate level of anxiety, but we also have people who we would say have clinical anxiety, meaning their anxiety is so much that they can no longer live a normal life. And if you're looking at that and you say, that's me, then I just want to say there's really great treatment for that. Cognitive behavioral therapy is great, and there's people who do that really well. So please don't be in a place and think there's no hope if I feel really anxious. But I want to say anxiety is really normal. So it's just part of the human condition.
With that in mind, maybe from a personal level to a cultural level then, what are cultural factors that you would say exacerbate anxiety? That's a great question. Before I talk about cultural factors, I just want to say we have a mismatch between our physiology and the culture we live in. So our industrialized, high-tech culture is not the kind of environment that our bodies were made to be in. We're actually made to be in environments where we exercise a lot, where we get a lot of sleep, and where threats
are bounded in time. So we're made to be in a situation where we're in the jungle with the tiger for a little bit, but then we can be away. The problem is the kind of threats we have today, or that we see as threats, aren't like that anymore. So for instance, if my boss is a threat to me, if my boss is kicking me into fight or flight, should I fight or flee my boss? Bad choice, right? Now I will say I have a great boss, so I don't feel any of those things. But the problem is that we're in these environments where our fight or flight response and our anxiety reaction is a mismatch for life. If you want a kind of clear example of that, how many of you have some kind of fear of heights? Like afraid of flying, afraid of standing on the mountain edge.
Skyscraper.
Yeah, part of that's wise. But for instance, if you're afraid of flying, that's because our bodies are not made to be at 30,000 feet up. And our psychology, we know that in our brains, right? Again, just this mismatch. Unfortunately, media and technology are exacerbating this mismatch. So if you think about media, what kind of news do we have? Is it all about rainbows and ponies and puppies? You know, once in a while you get a puppy article, but generally it's really negative. So, and watching that day in and day out, again, is kicking in our fight or flight response. And unfortunately, just the way we're made psychologically, sometimes danger and negative things actually pull us in deeper. And the people who make media know that, and so they're more likely to give us negative things. Again, just a little bit of mismatch with physiology. Technology is also hard, and I hope you don't read this as anti-technology, but technology can be hard and increase anxiety. Twenge lately did some research where she looked at 1 million adolescents, which is a lot of people, by the way, and found very clear relationships between how much they were using technology, particularly social media, video games, and some other things, and honestly, well-being, and found that the more screens, the lower the well-being, and could even track it. So one individual person, as they increased their screen use, their well-being went down, and then as they decreased their screen use, their well-being went up. And so we see these really kind of powerful effects, and unfortunately, for many of us, when we're anxious, what's the thing we do as a coping mechanism? We go into our screens, which actually just exacerbates that, unfortunately.
I was telling you this a little bit ago, but I'll tell you all because you're captive here. I was watching this special on 60 Minutes. It was this little clip, and this last summer, and it was talking about the attention economy. And so it was this guy who was really a part of the Silicon Valley. He was really helping in the development of apps when they were really taking off about 10 years ago to become what they are now. And he was talking about how he worked, with Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, these sort of things, and how they went from hiring people who just work my brain is so fried, in coding. So they didn't stop hiring, but they no longer only hired people who knew how to code computers and things like that, and started looking for neuroscientists and people who knew how to code the brain. And so the idea behind it was, one, this is an attention economy. So the goal is how long can we hold your attention? But two, they knew that there were certain ways, by studying the brain, they knew there were certain ways that you could actually trigger people to be in their apps more. So for example, Facebook, their notifications used to be gray or blue. So you'd get a message, it'd be gray or blue. When they changed it over to red, they saw a huge spike in interaction because it actually, even the color red stimulates something different. Or they did this experiment where they brought a guy in where they actually had his phone in the opposite side of the room as he was. So they told him that he was going to be looking at this screen or reading this article on the computer. But what they were doing is, what they didn't know is they were texting. He didn't realize they were texting him every few seconds, and his phone was dinging. And what they showed him afterwards was that his brain, every time his phone went off, just for a text, there was a spike in his brain for the chemicals that were released in his body. And so it was actually creating that same fight or flight response just from text messages. And so they were showing how it was even like the Pavlov's dog sort of thing, where you hear it and all of a sudden your body, at a neurobiological level, reacts to it. And so it actually is proving exactly what you're saying, that there's something that's more to than, our phones do something to us, our screens do something to us. It's not a neutral party. But with the idea of attention, that's probably the place where that's my only experience with anxiety. So a few years ago, I was finishing my grad program. I was working full time, everything else going on in life. And I remember it being January, and it was the first time in my life I ever experienced a form of anxiety. And I just remember waking up for that whole month every day, and my heart was just racing inside of me. I'd wake up and my mind was firing, and it was like I couldn't gain control of life and what was going on because there were so many things. And after talking to friends and mentors and pastors and just people in my life, I also have a counselor who I worked with, and they were just talking about the amount of things that were grabbing my attention and the amount of things that were interrupting me. And so they just said, what if you just didn't sleep with your phone in your room? And what if the first and last thing you did with your day wasn't on a screen, but instead maybe it was your Bible, or it was just with yourself? So what I did was I bought a real alarm clock. And so I bought one of those things, put it on the other side of my room, so I couldn't just smack it and snooze, but put it on the other side of my room, and whenever it'd go off, I would just I turn it off, and then I'd just sit on my bed for a few minutes and just breathe and just kind of welcome God and welcome the day. But also then I had to delete my work email off my phone. Sorry if you don't hear from me quickly, but I deleted my work email from my phone because, and I had to delete text notifications. So now my phone basically only rings if someone calls me, but I don't even see how many notifications I have for text because the way I was using my phone and technology was actually shaping me into a certain sort of person. And what it told me was, Christian, you wake up and you clean your house and you check your phone, you get your email, respond to text. Christian, your life exists to be productive. And the way that my lifestyle, my habits, they shaped me in a certain way. And so I had to kind of reshape my life in a way to tell me something different about who I am as a person. And I'm not a person who is, my end goal is to be productive or accomplish or to make it. I'm actually loved by God. My day can go good or bad, but it doesn't affect who I am as a person. There were different narratives I had to actually start to believe. So with that in mind, are there even other narratives that you would say are in our world, whether it's in the world as a whole or church, that maybe also contribute to this?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I talk about some of those, I just want to kind of second what you said. Some of these things we do, habits, and it could be with phones, but it could be with other things too, become liturgies. They actually become spiritual patterns, that they're not just, it's something I do as I pick up my phone, but the question is, what is that doing to me? So, and sometimes I worry about my own phone because I think the message it tells me is that life is about me. And that's not actually the message I want to have in my life. I want the message to be that life's actually about Jesus. And so how do I take this tool, this phone, and use it in a way that life is about Jesus and not telling me constantly it's about me and what I want and what I'm going to do? So let me talk about some other cultural messages, though. One of the ones I worry about, honestly, the most is about happiness. We get this cultural message that says we should be happy all the time. And I think this is dangerous because actually, if we think about our physiology, we're not made to be happy all the time. Just like we're made to be in fight or flight sometimes, we're also made sometimes to be happy because there's great things about happiness. It increases productivity and creativity and some things like that. But actually, there's some downsides to happiness. We're just not as productive. Sometimes when we're happy, and sometimes we aren't. And so there's good reason we're not happy all the time. It's important that we also eat and we also do some other things, right? And so our culture, however, tells us if you're not happy all the time, something must be wrong with you.
Yeah, even the mantra of America, pursuit of happiness.
Absolutely, absolutely. And on top of that, it tells us how to be happy. So what's the way to be happy? It's to buy the right deodorant, right? It's to buy the right product. And that actually, in the end, doesn't leave us happy. And so we end up even more unhappy. So just kind of FYI, you're totally normal if you're not happy all the time. And in fact, we're supposed to be not happy all the time.
Even that anecdote about the deodorant, one of my friends, he's, raising his kids, and he was telling his kids that a lot of times even the marketing and the ads, like billboards that you see, and he's trying to help his kids see what those billboards are saying. Because you'll see, for example, buy the new jeans, and it's some shirtless guy with a six-pack. And so his kid, I was walking with him one time, and his kid was like, if I buy those jeans, I won't have that six-pack. And I'm like...
What?
Yeah, that's true, actually. Because there's something else. The key to being happy isn't just having the right pants, it's looking the right way. And it's so subtle, but that could also say, I don't look like that even when I buy the pants. Wait a second. And it exacerbates some of these social conditions. What about the church, though? I know that's the world up there, but are there narratives within the church that maybe lead to this as well?
Yeah, I think there's narratives in the church, and I think there's narratives that we have about, that we're actually involved in parenting right now. So first of all, in the church, there's definitely this narrative, just kind of in the American cultural church, that we shouldn't suffer, which is completely unbiblical. In fact, if you look at Jesus, the main thing he did for us was actually to suffer. And why we would expect not to follow in that footstep, I don't know. I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that.
Well, I'd even wonder, just theology of suffering. So much of the scripture isn't only about how God takes away problems, but it's often how God's with us in them, how we should endure through them, how God produces our character out of them. But also, too, that, problems and suffering is not the end goal, too.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want to say that, to be a Christian is to suffer. No. Suffering is not celebrated in the scripture, but it is normalized.
Yeah.
And there's a call for endurance and hope in Christ in those moments.
Yeah.
So with that, sorry. Were you gonna?
I was just gonna say one other theme. I don't know if you're going there or not. But,
Go for it.
One other thing I think we should talk about is that we have this cultural message that life is really dangerous. And in fact, if you're a Gen Z, I'm a Gen Z parent, and I want to publicly apologize to you because we really have a whole generation of parents who are the first generation of parents with smartphones and lots of really scary things at their touch. And we know that Gen Z parents have been really, really protective and have given their children a message that life is really dangerous, kind of as a general rule. And if you've received that message, I want to say, life is dangerous always, but actually this is not the most dangerous time in human history. In fact, spend a little time studying the Middle Ages and you will be really happy to be here today. No Black Plague, no famine of the 14th century, and no horrible medical procedures. Do you know some of their favorite medical procedures were bloodletting and drilling a hole in your skull? None of which actually works well, if you've just wondered. In fact, they think the infant mortality rate in the Middle Ages was somewhere between 20% to 80% of children died before the age of 7. And so actually, although our cultural narrative is one of danger, it's not that dangerous to be alive right now.
What do you think then Jesus has to say about anxiety?
That's a great question. I think Jesus would first of all tell us that anxiety is not a sin. And if you have anxiety, I think you can take the anxiety off that maybe you've done something wrong. However, he doesn't necessarily, it's not a sin, but it's also not something that we should celebrate, although it can be protective, because the problem with anxiety from a spiritual level is that it makes us really self-focused, that we're constantly focusing on ourselves. And so we have to find the place where we can use the protective level of anxiety without becoming really self-focused about ourselves. We know that anxiety is normal. It's normal in the Bible. In fact, there's anxiety all over the Psalms. David was definitely an anxious person, and for good reason if you've read his life. We also know that Daniel was anxious, and the disciples are clearly anxious all over the place in the Gospels. In fact, one of my very favorite stories of Jesus in the Gospels and disciples being anxious is Jesus in the boat. So do you remember that? So Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee. They're in the boat. A storm comes up, and the disciples are afraid, and Jesus is sleeping in the stern. And I have to admit, if I'd been a disciple, I'd been kind of mad too. I would kind of be in that Mary and Martha. I'd be the Martha, and I'd be like, Jesus, won't you take an oar? What in the world are you doing? Right? But they're afraid. They think they're going to die. And then they say, Jesus, wake up and help us. And he stands up, and he calms the waves, and he calms the wind. And there's some things that I really like about that. First of all, it tells us that anxiety is normal. The disciples aren't super Christians. They're not in the boat, and they think, oh, all will be well. No, they're terrified, right? But Jesus is with them. He may be asleep on the cushion, but he is absolutely with them, just like he's in our moments of anxiety. And he's in control, that at any moment he can stand up and he can quiet everything. The thing I like the very best, though, is that Jesus actually reveals that he's God in that moment. So there's lots of allusions. When he stands up and he quiets the wind and the waves, it's definitely allusions to Psalm 46, where God says, "Be still and know that I am God." If you do a reading of the Old Testament, whenever something happens where there's control of water, so it happens in the Psalms, it happens in Job, we see it in the Red Sea, we see it in the parting of the River Jordan, that always is done only by God. And so when Jesus stands up and he calms the waves, he is saying, I am God. And I think God particularly reveals himself to us in our anxious moments. When I was in college, my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and it was very bad. So they had she had a lump in her breast. They'd misdiagnosed it for years. And by the time they said, hey, maybe that actually is cancer, she was in stage 4. And so I was going into the beginning of my junior year. It was very difficult. I was very anxious. We didn't know what was going to happen. In fact, I can remember this very clear, one of my clearest memories is she had to have a bone scan to see if it had spread, which it had. And she wouldn't get on. She was like a little child and refused to get on the bone scanning machine. And I had to make her get on the bone scan. And I thought, I am the parent now. It was this really disturbing, clear memory I have. And yet, God was so real in that season to me. In fact, I really became saved in that season, along with a lot of difficult things that happened. And I really think that there's a special moment sometimes in our hardest, darkest, most anxious times where God most reveals himself as God, where he's most glorified, even if we don't like it.
It makes me think of Matthew 6, and I asked them to pull it up on the screen. It says, these are Jesus' words, God himself. Therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Isn't life more than food and the body more than clothing? Consider the birds of the sky. They don't sow or reap or gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you worth more than they? Can any of you add one moment to his lifespan by worrying? And why do you worry about clothes? Observe how the wildflowers of the field grow. They don't labor or spin thread. Yet I tell you that even Solomon in all his splendor was not adorned like one of these. If that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and thrown into the furnace tomorrow, won't he do much more for you? You have little faith. So don't worry saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear? For the Gentiles eagerly seek these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. I think sometimes people think that Christians can just be like obnoxiously happy for the sake of just be happy, be positive. And being positive for the sake of being positive is kind of just insanity. I think Jesus is such a realist. I mean, look at that. He says you don't have to worry about tomorrow, but he says tomorrow has enough trouble on its own. Jesus actually acknowledges that the next day does carry its own problems, its own troubles, its own things, but he says in those you don't have to worry. And I like that. And again, I'll say, this verse isn't talking specifically about anxiety. This is talking about worry, which is different. So I want to acknowledge that. But I do think there's something overarching that's saying, when I'm not just commanded not to worry, I'm actually commanded to consider how God cares for nature, and he'll care for me the same way. So like this summer, I went on a walk out in the middle of the workday because it was nice in Seattle. And so I went on a walk outside my door, and outside my office, I have this big window, and there's this spider that was like creating this massive web. I hate spiders. If you know me, they freak me out. I just don't do that. So for real, I have like spider spray in my office. I'm crazy. So I saw the spider, but we made agreement. If that didn't come to my office, it could live there. So it lived there. And one day I go out for this walk. And that verse was just in my mind, Matthew 6, I'd read. And so I felt like I just needed to stop, and I just stared at the spider web, which just made me uncomfortable, but I did it. And the wind was blowing a little bit, but I was looking at the spider in the middle of its web, and I slammed my door, and it shook the web. And as I looked at the spider, thinking about Jesus' words, I realized that spider is so positioned well for life. What does it do? It just sits in the creation that God called it to sit in, and it knows that if it waits there, God will provide food for it. So the spider doesn't have to work. The food comes to it. God provides even for the spider. And even so, when I closed the door too hard and it shook the web, it didn't freak out. The spider literally just held on, and it was fine. And it just, even watching creation in some ways, reminds me of the way that God cares for us. And I think that's what Jesus is inviting us to do. Consider a different narrative about the world. Consider a different way that the world works. The world can be dangerous and scary, but God actually oversees it all. So really with that in mind, with our last moments, what do you think we should do about our anxiety?
That's great. This is always my favorite question, but what do you do? So I want to talk a little bit about the Bible, and I want to talk a little bit about science, and they actually dovetail with each other pretty well. So what does the Bible say? The Bible says first about reach out to God. Cast your cares on the Lord. Come to him. And that's definitely the first thing we always need to do. And also, like Christian said, to trust him. Trust him to meet our needs. Trust him to be with us. And also, we're also called to share each other's burdens. We're not made to live alone. I'll talk a little bit later when I talk about science. One of the things that science tells us to do is actually to live life together, because that's really healthy for us, and that's exactly what the Bible tells us to do too. That as we're in community and we help each other and we walk through anxious issues with each other, that really leads to health and healing. So just a couple of thoughts from the Bible. I want to talk about a scientific perspective too. The first thing I'd recommend that the literature says is exercise. And I have to admit, this has been my own lesson too. So most people have some kind of trigger for their anxiety. Mine tends to be some illness. I grew up in a family where my dad was a doctor, my mom was a nurse, and they talked way too much about illness when I grew up. And so I just had way too many narratives of bad things that could happen. And so generally, if I'm going to be anxious about something, I think I have cancer all the time. Well, I had come to a season about 10 years ago where it was spring, and I had all these stomach trouble. I had an MRI, and I realized that actually I didn't have cancer. What I had was some kind of anxiety-related health problem. Like there was something wrong in my head. And I had been teaching psychology for about 15 years, and at that point, almost every class I taught, there was something in the class that said you should exercise. That it was good for your health, it was good for your mental illness. It was actually good for your mental health. Just lots of different things, and I thought, something's wrong with me, maybe I should exercise. And so I started to exercise, and I started to exercise an hour a day every day just because I am like weird in general. And I found that it cut my anxiety more than anything else I'd ever done. And so I actually continue to exercise about an hour every day, simply because it makes me so much less anxious. In fact, my husband will be like, go exercise. Like, I'm tired of talking to you. We've enough of that. So I have personally found it to be really helpful, and the literature says it as well. One of the best things you can do for depression and anxiety is to exercise. In fact, we think today that somebody who exercises regularly, and I'm talking weightlifting is good in other ways, but cardiovascular exercise is probably as good as antidepressants for people with mild or moderate depression. If you have more than moderate, you really need other things too. But again, just really helpful. And also as a bonus, great for the immune system, great for cardiovascular health, great for weight. And one of the things I love, it's actually one of the best things you can do for your brain. In fact, if you're worried about Alzheimer's and dementia, which I really hope you're not right now, but sometimes I am, again, because I'm weird, the best thing you can do to prevent Alzheimer's and dementia is to exercise, actually. And so you can kind of hold that for some other period in life. So a couple other things. I guess I'm too much of evangelism for exercise right now, but I believe in other things too. One is to connect with people. Another one of the things that as I taught psych, I realized almost every class I taught, it said, well, one way to be healthier and happier is to be in good relationship with each other. We often call this social support as a researcher. Basically means you just have some friends that you trust that you can share life with. And again, people who have friends who they can trust and share life with are so much better, less anxiety, less depression, and honestly, even better physical health. One of the new studies that is just crazy is showing that people who have good social connections, that is just as good of a health benefit as stopping smoking. Whoa. Which is huge. Now, this is not, the message I'm giving you is not to keep smoking if you're smoking. Stop smoking. But it is saying that our social connections are so powerful that they're just incredibly healthy in our lives. A couple other things. If you're having anxious thoughts, fact-checking is great. Saying to yourself, well, would I actually die if I failed that exam? And if you were wondering, the answer is no, you would not die. I've seen students fail exams and they didn't die, so you're totally good. Also, writing things down. One study by Klein and Bowles shows that people who write down their difficulties, it actually increases their working memory, and that's terrific because one of the things stress does is it lowers working memory. And so writing down is great. A couple other things, focusing on being in the present. I am absolutely horrible at this. I live in the future all the time, and I mostly live in the anxious future. But mindfulness is a practice where you encourage yourself to think about the now. You can do it by focusing on breathing, by focusing on your senses, but I encourage you, even just Google mindfulness, and it'll teach you some good skills to kind of detox from anxiety. The last one is to engage with God. And I think this is really cool because this comes all out of the scientific literature, but scientists are saying more and more and more that faith and faith practices are incredibly healthy. For instance, things like prayer and meditation lower all of the things you don't want, like your cortisol levels, which has to do with stress, and they're increasing serotonin and all these great things that make you feel good. Also, really, really good for your health. In fact, did you know that people who read their Bible and pray typically have about 40% lower blood pressure, according to Coining? So, which is a marker of stress. So there's just lots of really good things. And just for free, there's one really big demographic study that's showing that people who just attend church and are involved in church practices live about 10 years longer than those who don't. So just lots of really great things, just continuing to be part of a Christian community.
Which means if you go to chapel, you're more likely to live longer.
Exactly. So keep going to chapel.
Exactly. So end it today. Here's what we want to end with. Just this thought. And Sarah wrote this. I think it's a fantastic way to end. Anxiety is hard, but normal. And Jesus is with us in it. Can we see that together? Anxiety is hard, but normal. And Jesus is with us in it. Have a good day. God bless.
Thank you.